Good evening, and thank you very much for the invitation, and especially I would like to thank Professor Bachmann for this invitation. So the main topic of this little conference is music and the brain, and so I have chosen a topic and a lecture which we can relate to this topic. I would like to present to you a theory of aesthetic eigenvalues of perception, which I developed in my book, Gehaltsästhetik, an art philosophy. And aesthetic eigenvalues, as you can see here, are beauty, sublimity, the event, and ambivalence. But I do not like only to present to you the dry theory. I would like to show how this theory works, and I would like to exemplify the theory with examples. And because this is a music festival, I would like to show you music examples. And I will start with a medieval piece from music, because the whole European tradition is based on the eigenvalue of beauty, and that would be an example of beauty. And only later, when art became modern and when new music developed, artists and composers started to explore other alternative eigenvalues to beauty. So that is my main topic. Especially I will refer to examples from Stockhausen, Ligeti, and Lachenmann. And in addition to the music examples, I would like to show you some paintings which are closely related to these aesthetics of alternative eigenvalues. And you will see a painting from Kline, Braque, and Newman, and you immediately see this is not anymore an aesthetic of beauty, this is a modern aesthetic. This theory of aesthetic eigenvalues is based on a model of perception. And this model is a bipartite model of perception. The basic idea is any perceptual apparatus is based on two processes. It's a process of gestalt formation and of attention or attention shift. That are two basic perceptual functions which you will find everywhere, even not only by human beings, but only in the perception of animals. Animals construct by the help of remote senses, that is, by the help of vision and hearing, a gestalt. Gestalt formation has a survival function. Animals need that capacity to identify food, mating partners, or predators in order to move closer or farther away from them. And attention, again, has such a survival function. It is the ability to focus the perception apparatus on what is happening on the marginal horizon of perception. Let's take an example. There is a cat hunting a mouse, but the cat, of course, has to shift her attention towards the dog, which is barking behind her. So attention has and gestalt formation have these survival functions. And gestalt formation and attention are both biological functions, but eigenvalues of perception, they are not. That is the basic idea. They are anomalies, they are hyperfunctions and dysfunctions of these general perceptual functions. Let's start and discuss the hyperfunctions first, and let's start with the eigenvalue of beauty. Beauty is an extreme gestalt, or let's say it is an iterated gestalt. You see here a golden spiral in a shell, which is based on a golden section again. And this special gestalt on proportion appears twice, and hence this proportion which has twice the same proportion in it stimulates also twice the perceptual apparatus. And by the same reason, we hear the perfect octave as an harmonious sound. Eigenvalues do not fulfill a function, a biological function. They are much more a side effect. For instance, if you build a washing machine or a bridge, then it will happen that you have resonance frequencies, and usually the engineers will call it eigenfrequencies of the buildings and the machine. And that is an analogy to what I mean with eigenvalues, that are the eigenvalues of our perceptual apparatus. On the other side, we have a second hyperfunction on the attention side. It's the event, and an event is not only a perception of something what is new. An event is a perception which requires absolute attention. So you have a thunder and a lightning in a thunderstorm, and these are such perceptions which attract all your attention. You can't escape this attention, they captivate all your attention. Beauty and event are eigenvalues of perception which are caused by an information overflow. And in contrast, the dysfunction of perception are caused by an information deficit in the gestalt formation and in the attention system. At the bottom left corner, you see an example for the sublime, a view over the wide open sea. The perceptual apparatus is stimulated by any visual information for a gestalt formation, but it will fail in front of a large, still body of water. So, it's again a special case of perception, a case for what the perceptual apparatus is not evolved for, because now it is confronted with a case of a formless gestalt. The gestalt formation in such perceptions is caught in an infinite feedback loop. This kind of perception triggers in us the feeling of sublimity. At the bottom right corner, there is an example for the eigenvalue of ambivalence. There's an owl in front of a tree whose feathers look like the tree bark. There is not enough visual information to distinguish entirely the figure from the background. Not only does the attentional system shift our focus to what it is new, it also causes us to lose interest in a shape that we have already recognized. We are bored by such a gestalt. Our attention shifts away. Perceptual ambivalences delay this shift of focus. They delay our boredom. They attract our attention more and longer than a normal gestalt. It is more interesting for us to look at ambivalence than to look on a gestalt which we immediately can recognize. Again, this is not a normal perception, it's an anomaly, it's a special case, or it's a special perceptual situation. The gestalt is there and it is not there. So I summarize this introduction in the theory of eigenvalues. It's based on a perception theory which says that there are two different mechanisms involved in any perception. It's gestalt formation and an attention shift toward what is new. And then we have four special cases, four anomalies. The iterated gestalt, the formless gestalt, something which causes absolute attention, and phenomena which delay the inattention, our inattention. Aesthetic eigenvalues can be used. They can be used first by the biological evolution, and they can be used, of course, by cultural evolution, and that happened. For instance, in the biological evolution, there has been developed patterns of camouflage, like with this owl. and that has the function to hide from predators. Or there has been the development of sexual ornaments like colorful feathering on peacocks or bird songs from the nightingale, which attract mating partners. And in the cultural evolution, you have, of course, the evolution of the arts. And the old arts, the classical arts, or at least the European arts, they always exploited the eigenvalue of beauty. Only the modern arts started to shift their attention to alternative eigenvalues, to the eigenvalues of sublimity, eventness, and ambivalence. And I have to add, because these eigenvalues have been, of course, always present in the history of arts, but they haven't present in a pure form, like you can see it here on these paintings. So you see immediately the similarities between the perception of nature and of artwork. So I'm shifting here, and you see it. I think it's quite obvious. Eigenvalues are anomalies of the default perceptual function of gestalt formation and attention. The theory is compatible with the research of empirical aesthetics and, of course, also of neuroaesthetics. So in the book, I refer then to the theories of Helmut and Berlin and Zemyoseki. But it doesn't help our understanding of art and music if we know that beauty is caused by an overflow of information. And it doesn't help if we know that the sublime is caused by a deficit of information in the neural circuits of our brain. So we need words that we can apply to the description and interpretation of artworks instead of only neuroaesthetic terminology. This graph presents such words which we can apply for an analysis and an interpretation of artwork in respect to the aesthetic eigenvalues. We can describe every eigenvalue by two complementary parameters. Beauty we can describe as an interplay of order and contrast, and that becomes most apparent in an ornament, because you have there orders and repetition and contrast. An event you can describe as by the two complementary parameters of suddenness and intensity, and here you can always make a test. Are these really complementary parameters? You make a thought experiment. You say, what would happen if we have only a sudden phenomenon without intensity? So somebody is coughing here, but because everybody is polite, it will not be very loud and it will not interrupt you. It doesn't take all my attention. Or if you have, the other experiment is that you have a very intense stimulus, like let's say a starting airplane on the airport. But this is not sudden, it is a continuation of noise. And again, it's not an event. So you can make always the thought experiment, are these really two parameters which have to be present simultaneously, and they will create some kind of a maximum, an extreme, and that's exactly the two parameters which will describe the eigenvalue. Sublimity is an interplay of formlessness and infinity, and ambivalence of indeterminacy and alienation. And alienation is here in the sense of Bertolt Brecht with his idea of an alienation effect in theater. Sometimes you call it also a distancing effect. So this is a theoretical framework, and now I would like to explain it on concrete music examples. Let's start with beauty. It's an interplay of order and contrast. And let's start with this wonderful middle-age altarpiece from Simone Martini and Lippo Memmi, Annunciation, with St. Margaret and St. Manzanos from 1333. And it becomes very clear and obvious that these Middle-aged painters worked with ornamentation. The ornament is, in a way, the epitome of beauty. Order and contrast are used in this painting in order to increase the aesthetic effect of the picture. So the painters copied, for instance, the tracery of a Gothic church, and this appears in the wooden frame here. Or you have an ornament of the flying doves in the center of the picture, so they fly together in a circle. And you have a lot of symmetries in the picture, and you have even a golden section. So the size of St. Margaret on the right side is probably like a golden section in comparison with the high of the wooden frame. By the same principle, I would like to analyze now a piece from Perotin, Veterunt Omnes from 1198. The title is All the Ends of the Earth Have Seen the Salvation of Our God. It's one of the first 3 or 4 part polyphony in European music history. And what is special about the European music is that it's notated music, and only in the medium of notation, of written music, you can memorize and perform such a polyphonic work. Ornaments in music, or this idea of the ornament, you can find here, because the music piece works with repetition. It's a repetition of the same melody fragments and rhythmic patterns, and in the same time it's a variation of the melody fragments and the rhythmic patterns. In my book, I developed also a theory of Medienverschachtelung. This is very difficult to translate. You can translate it like a medium nesting. So it's like putting one medium in another. And by this technique, the European arts, you can analyze the evolution of the European arts, which increased the likelihood of the experience of beauty. They increased the degree of order and contrast. And at the end, we have in music the tonal system. Now let's go to the side of the dysfunction of Gestalt formation. It's a perception of formlessness, and it should be an infinite perception if it will create an experience of the sublime. Here you see a painting from Barnett Newman, Vera Heroicus Sublimis from 1950-1951. And I have chosen this example because the Sublime is in the title. So the translation is Man, Heroicus and Sublime, and probably you can understand it as a symbol of mankind. It's a huge, almost monochromatic canvas. The painting, but such a painting does not necessarily create a sublime experience. If you enter a museum and you see far in the museum room this painting, you will rather perceive it as a red rectangle than experience a sublime object. It's because in a distance it is a finite object. So, and Barnett Newman knew that, and when he for the first time exhibited his big paintings, he wrote an instruction manual for the gallery, and in this instruction manual he said that the viewers of this painting should go very close to the painting. The people should look at the painting from a very close distance. Why? You do not see the edges. The impression of is from this very close perspective not limited. In other words, it's an infinite perception, and that's exactly what you need for a sublime experience. So the question, of course, is, and what do these stripes mean? And don't these stripes not disturb the sublime experience? And that is a very tricky question, and I think I can explain it to you if I refer to the most famous and sublime painting of the classical times, to Caspar David Friedrich, The Monk by the Sea. So it's the most sublime pre-modern painting, I would say. Art historians, there are two aspects important and interesting. Art historians discovered recently that Friedrich painted over the two ships in the middle ground, and my explanation would be that Friedrich wanted to have a sublime experience, but if you have the ships in the middle ground, they will cause a process, they will trigger a gestalt formation process, and you will have an finite perception, but you will not have an infinite process of perception. So the monk in the foreground, that's the second interesting aspect, is very small in relation to the whole picture. And of course, there's this symbolic meaning of man's lonely existence in the universe, but the small figure fulfills also an aesthetic function, and that is an important point I want to make. It's like a measurement unit for the whole picture. In comparison with this small human figure, the skyline seems to be infinitely far away. And in comparison with the figure, the heaven above the monk appears to be infinitely large. And in this way, I also would like to interpret these stripes on Barnett Newman's painting. They fulfill the same function like the little monk figure in Friedrich's painting. They are measurement units for the aesthetic perception of red in comparison to the small stripes. You experience this red color space as an infinitely large space if you have this small experience of the stripes. That would be my interpretation, and what makes this abstract expressionist paintings so different from the paintings, from the sublime paintings of Friedrich, is that this is a painting, and that is for the first time a painting which explores sublimity in a pure form. It's without human figure, without ocean, without clouds. There are only these little stripes in this color space. And one could say that the stripes calibrate our perception on an experience of the sublime. So I come to my music example, György Ligeti's Atmosphères from 1961 for orchestra. The general characterization of this piece that it's a Klangflächenkomposition, and literally you could translate it like a composition for sound surfaces or sound masses or soundscapes. In this beautiful visualization you can see, it's not my visualization, how one sound surface transforms into the next, into another sound surface. Sublimity is constituted by the two parameters of formlessness and infinity. And these soundscapes are, of course, formless. There's no melody, there's no rhythm, there are only very slow changes in pitch and volume. What changes is the timbre or the Klangfarbe of the music. So soundscapes are constructed by a special compositional technique, and this technique is called micropolyphony. In the beginning, they are playing 74 instruments which play all single voices, and these single voices interweaving in an indistinguishable way and create this surface, this sound surface. So it is that is an amorphous sound. But an amorphous sound is not necessarily a sublime sound. Think about a situation in a pub or at a noisy party. It's amorphous, but it's not sublime. So again, we need a second parameter, and the experience of sublimity depends on the second parameter, and that is in this case infinity. And Ligeti uses very different techniques to create such experience of musical acoustic infinity. And the first technique relates to the intervals. Our ear can recognize different pitch levels, or let's say intervals between two notes, and the sound surface has the range of about 5 octaves. That interval is in comparison with the common musical intervals of a third, of a fourth, of a fifth. It's infinitely large. It's an infinitely large, it's an unhuman large interval. And in this sense, Ligeti creates an infinite dimension of these soundscapes, which is beyond human dimension, or at least beyond normal human expectation. The second technique relates to the high and to the depth which he uses. I would like to play you a section. You see the section there, it's this triangle which goes up, and here morphs a sound surface into voices of 4 piccolo flutes. And these piccolo flutes moving slowly into very extreme heights, and this sound is very intense. It's a high volume and a high pitch. And after a while, if it's very high, it drops suddenly down to very low cellos and cello sounds. And that is, by the way, the only event. It's an aesthetic event, but the only aesthetic event in the whole piece, and it's exactly in the middle of the piece. So it divides Atmosphères in a way in 2 halves. In this section, the listening experience is again amorphous. You cannot distinguish the 4 flutes. It's one line. There's no melody, there's no rhythm, and Ligeti creates an experience of infinity because he really goes up to this threshold of human hearing, and not only in the height, but also in the depth. And it is also a very loud sound. And a third technique is to create an experience of acoustic infinity. You can call it the sublimity of big numbers. If you look in the sky, you look at these countless numbers of stars, that can trigger also an experience of sublimity. And in this piece we hear a section which sounds like a swarm of bees, and a swarm is also this creates this experience of infinity because that are individual sound sources, but they are countless. And the whole piece is composed in a way that it's one experience of sublimity transfers into another. And every soundscape is amorphous, or formlessness. Formless, it's a formlessness sound, plus there is a special acoustic infinity, so an infinite bandwidth, or extreme high or low pitches, or extreme loudness, or an infinite number of sound sources. And there are more such techniques, and you can find more such techniques of sublimity in Ligeti's piece. I describe them and analyze them in the book, but I only want to mention here that the last section is also an example for sublimity, and in this section the conductor is conducting in silence. And in this situation, it works like a minute of silence on a funeral and causes this sublime experience too. So let's come to the event. It's on the attention side, and it's a hyperfunction of perception. So it's a perception of exponentiated newness. Such perception will trigger an absolute attention, and we can call this as an aesthetic event. Two parameters are important, and which I will describe and analyze now, and that is suddenness and intensity. And my example is Karlheinz Stockhausen's Kreuzspiel from 1951. It's for oboe, bass clarinet, piano, and 3 percussionists. It's an example of punctionalism. You can call it sometimes also point music. And this music consists of separately formed sound particles. But these sound particles do not form a melody line or a theme or a motive. They do not have any development. There is no connection between these acoustic particles. If you hear one point, then you do not have any hint when will occur the other point. So there is no gestalt formation process in this music, though this gestalt formation process is blocked, you can say, or suppressed. And the compositional technique behind this punctionalism are in a way abstract mathematical rules which define in an abstract manner, not in a musical manner, in an abstract manner, pitch, duration, dynamics, and the attack characteristics. So the points are then, because of these abstract rules, they are separated events. I would like to play you the first boss, and I think it's obvious that this piece works with the aesthetic impression of an event. So that is for the first impression. Punctualism creates by its own definition something like event music. But I have chosen Kreuzspiel because Stockhausen uses in the piece some kind of a trick which intensifies and amplifies the aesthetic experience of events. The trick is a permanent pulse which is played by 2 tambas, so 2 drums from the Caribbean which are played by hand. And the pulse increases the degree of suddenness of the events. The rhythm of the toms creates, like any rhythm, an expectation in time and provides in this way a time raster or a time grid. And in consequence, any musical event which doesn't fit in this time raster seems to be even more unexpected. So the timbre rhythm creates an expectation for the next event, and this expectation is always disappointed by this composition. So the timbre rhythm amplifies the unexpectedness or suddenness of the points in the punctualist piece. So I play this part again, and please listen to this mismatch of the timbre rhythm and the musical events. So events interrupt our perception in time, and that's why events are much more obvious in time-based arts like in music, but you can find also work which in the visual arts works which work with the aesthetic eigenvalue of the event, especially here in this abstract expressionist painting of Franz Kline. First, the painting avoids the trigger, again, any gestalt formation process. It's a pure impression of a black and white figure. It's a black figure on a white ground, but the black figure is undefined. So it's a pure, meaningless, sensual impression. Even with a lot of fantasy, it is difficult to find any symbolic meaning in this painting. And, of course, the title of the painting is abstract, black and white. In an event, we have two complementary parameters, suddenness. This painting is, in a way, works with suddenness because you never have seen such an impression if you see this for the first time. It doesn't remember you to anything. And Kline tries to create the most intense impression because he uses the strongest contrast. It's just contrast of black and white, and he uses a big format. So in this way you can find also the event in the visual arts. The last eigenvalue of perception is aesthetic ambivalence, and I have to say that is the most difficult eigenvalue, at least in music. And therefore I will start with the example in the visual arts. And my example for ambivalence is György Braque's Violin in György from 1910. It's an example of analytical cubism, and that is quite obvious. It is based on an aesthetics of ambivalence. The painting of Braque keeps our attention by presenting us a perception riddle. So we can see the jug and the violin, and we don't see it. At least it is an image which is entirely unstable. So how did the cubists create such visual ambivalences? First, they did not use colors, but only gray and brown shades. Usually one can distinguish an object by its color from its environment. Every object has its own colors, naturally. So if you dissolve this most fundamental distinction of figure and ground, like the analytical cubist did, then it becomes much more difficult to see. So it becomes very difficult to decide what is in this picture the figure and what belongs to the ground. So abandonment of the abandonment of the natural colors is a technique to increase the indeterminacy, and that is only the first parameter to characterize ambivalence. Cubism follows also an abstract concept, and this abstract concept stands for the second parameter. And this abstract this concept is to present an object from different angles of view, from different viewpoints simultaneously, not only from the front, but from the sides, from above and beneath. And this idea leads us to an unnatural representation of these objects. One can see the elements of the objects, and that's why you can identify the jug and the violin, but you cannot find the whole picture. You cannot see the whole object. The Cubist principle of unnatural representation leads to an alienation, and as I already mentioned, I mean with alienation Verfremdung, V-effect, like Brecht introduced the terminus. You do something that makes it more difficult to recognize what you are used to perceive and to see and to hear. And alienation is the second parameter of aesthetic ambivalence. So, and here you can make again the test. All these really the two complementary parameters. First, you make the thought experiment. What happens when Braque's painting was lacking the moment of indeterminacy? That is, if the violin and the jug would be painted in natural colors, what would be happen? We would see very clear the different parts of a jug and of a violin in front of the background. These parts would not, but these parts would not fit together because of this other cubistic principle. We would see strange broken objects, but there would not be an ambivalence in this perception because it would be clear. It's a broken jug and a strange jug and a strange violin, but we would not see, it would not be ambivalent for us. It would not be an ambivalent perception, what would delay our boredom. The second thought experiment would be, what would happen when Braque's painting was lacking the moment of alienation? That is, if the object were painted from one point of view and not from many, like it is here. It would be a bit difficult to recognize the violin and the jug, insofar the two objects have the same color shades like the background, but it would not be impossible, and after a while, with more attention and with more time, we would recognize the objects. And then, again, we would not have an ambivalent phenomenon. It would be an object. So in this sense, alienation and indeterminacy are the two complementary parameters of ambivalence. And now I can step forward to my music example, what is probably the most difficult example at that evening. It's an example from Musique concrète instrumentale from Helmut Lachenmann, who became the most influential new music composer in Germany, at least, in the recent years, at least until 2000. And it is music concrète, like from Pierre Schaeffer, but the concrete sounds are not recorded sounds, but they are generated by classical acoustic instruments like a violin and a piano. But for that purpose, the instruments are not used in the usual way. and in a normal way they are produced by special techniques, and these special techniques are called extended playing techniques. And you will see and hear that means, for instance, that you don't play the violin but you scratch it, and that, for instance, you knock on the body of the violin. Just listen to the example. I play you 1 minute of the first string quartet from Helmut Lachenmann, Gran, and you see it here too. These extended playing techniques are probably the most striking and maybe also the most disturbing aspects of this piece, but it is only the technique of sound production. It doesn't say anything about how these concrete sounds are put together, meaning how this piece is composed. And in his essay Klangtypen der neuen Musik from 1966, Helmut Lachenmann introduced the idea of einen Strukturklang, or Klangstruktur, and you can translate it like sound structures. Sound structures are composed of little concrete sounds, but in the compositional and listening process, the emerging structure starts to organize itself. Lachenmann maintains that sound structures possess an Eigenzeit. That means an Eigentime, and you see this idea of Eigenzeit, Eigentime is very closely related to our idea of eigenvalue. It's not the same, but it comes close. Lachenmann's idea of Eigentime means that the acoustic element of a sound structure triggers a gestalt formation process of our audial experience. Perception. During a sound structure is building up, it simultaneously creates an expectation that this sound structure will come to an end. And that is exactly what Lachenmann means with Eigenzeit or Eigentime. So let's assume Gran is composed out of sound structures. What will happen if we listen to it? In the process of carefully listening, and you really have to listen very carefully, otherwise it will be noise. It will only be noise. So if you carefully listen, and of course, if you have a really great performance, because you can always fail with musique concrète instrumentale. You use the extended techniques, but somebody cannot compose, so you don't know how to put together a structural sound or a sound structure, or the interpretation is bad. The musicians don't have the feelings how to put it together, though it's very tricky, I think. So in the process of carefully listening to the piece, we have this inner feeling that in a certain moment this structure builds up, and then it should come to an end. But it is only a hypothesis, because the music doesn't stop, it's continuing. Actually, one sound structure goes over into another sound structure. So we are caught up in a continuum of music. We never know what is the beginning and what is the end of such a structure, but we have always this expectation that a sound structure will begin or will end. And listening to Kreuzspiel means permanently building up sound structure hypothesis. And that is like looking at the violin and the jug in Braque's Cubist painting. You hear, respectively, you see an ambivalent gestalt. Kreuzspiel is a kind of an acoustic puzzle in analogy to the picture puzzles. Listening to the piece is like going through a row of acoustic flip-flop images. And that is the aesthetic effect of the piece. It's not beautiful, it's not sublime, it's not doesn't work with events. It works with this ambivalence. The piece puts us in a permanent state of listening ambivalence, like an ambivalent perception. The ambivalent character of the music keeps our attention. If we get into the music, it keeps our attention longer than other music. And we are focused more on this music. The music isn't beautiful, that's clear, even if Lachenmann thinks and writes that he wants to invent a new idea of beauty. I disagree in this point. I think he works with another aesthetic value. But of course, as long as there doesn't exist an aesthetic theory which suggested this different vocabulary, then of course composers and artists can only use the aesthetic vocabulary which is available, and definitely in 1966 it was not available. Hence the aesthetic value of this new music piece is the eigenvalue of ambivalence, and I would conclude, and I would like to invite you to listen to Lachenmann's piece again under this listening perspective of ambivalent sound structures and acoustic flip-flop images. So I'm at the end of my lecture. This theory of aesthetic eigenvalues, I think, has two implications. First, you can use this as a heuristical model for neuroaesthetic research. So you can develop new experiments, and second, this theory is important for music history, because in music philosophy, or in general in art philosophy, there are a couple of main questions. For instance, why was the European art always beautiful art? Why did the idea of beauty came to an end? And how it is possible that modern arts rejected beauty? And what did happen? And why did it happen? And but by the help of this theory, you can explain this and answer on this question. So beauty has been exhausted. After Beethoven and Wagner, it was very clear that you cannot overcome these compositions. You cannot increase the experience of beauty, and at the beginning of the 20th century, composers really felt it deeply, and then they rejected this eigenvalue of beauty, and they started to look for other aesthetic experiences. And what they did is really to explore other eigenvalues. These three important eigenvalues of sublimity, eventness, and ambivalence in a pure form. And in a way, this was the starting point for new music. New music which rejected the tonal system, and with the rejection of the tonal system, you reject beauty in music. After a while, in a way, even this new music is exhausted, and that means today that you cannot explore any other new eigenvalues of perception. For at least 20, 30 years, that became very clear, and you cannot create new isms. You only can repeat, and you can combine, and you can play with the aesthetics of new music, which has already developed. But this idea of material progress, which refers back to Adorno, this is exhausted, and material progress was always in music, exploring new possibilities of listening and of composing, and this came to an end. And that is, of course, then the turning point to an anesthetic art music, and that is in a way what's happening now. In Germany, at least, it's the discovery of conceptual music. And this is the point I would like to end today. Thank you very much.